Among musicians who make a living playing ancient instruments, there is a common anecdote. A story often told in the form of a joke, though with a more serious and at times even a little cynical undertone. After the end of a concert, it sometimes happens that a friendly and genuinely well-meaning compliment from members of the audience is followed up by that one question we all dread. So, what do you do for a living? It happened to me a couple of times as well. I know that feeling. And I know that look I get when explaining that I'm a professional lutenist. And then I think to myself that this is what it must be like for professional frisbee players. Well, the public perception of whatever interests me shouldn't normally concern me too much. But in this case, I had to realize that how others see me is exactly what constitutes the professional musician's livelihood. And it's actually kind of difficult to exactly pinpoint what the general public will first associate with a professional lute player. Do they perhaps work full-time on Renaissance fairs? Maybe they never quite manage to outgrow their video games. Or can they be found in forests and fields dressed up as princesses and knights?
Now, Bart, would you care to listen to me play the lute?
Sure.
Come home, my bonny warrior, for now the nets are full of fish.
It seemed like all that might suddenly change when British celebrity Sting decided to pick up the lute some years ago. And even though he still mostly served the old misconceptions and failed to do John Dowland's songs any justice, was I so base that I might not aspire unto those many had hopes that he might at least bring widespread attention back to the world of early music. But
the only two words that promise more boredom in the English language are featuring Sting. And
come again, that I may cease to mourn through thy unkind distress.
And hearing people talk about it is somehow even worse.
Sometimes it seems like the last thing that comes to mind is the lute being just, a musical instrument, like the violin or the piano, and that one doesn't necessarily have to appreciate it because it's old or funny or eccentric, but simply because it enables us to express ourselves just as well today as 500 years ago. the lute become strange? From another time? Why did it die out in the first place? In order to approach this question, it's important to understand it as part of an entire musical tradition, which in turn was integral to cultural life as a whole. Museums today tend to group paintings from a very particular set of centuries and usually display them together, under one roof. This range encompasses the 14th century, the 15th, 16th, 17th and 18th. All artists from that enormous time span form a category those museums call the Old Masters. And despite the enormous changes that happened throughout those 500 years, the lute had a central role in the cultural life of every one of them. So what happened? What made this ship with the lute and all the old masters on board sink after having sailed merrily for 5 centuries? In his influential book, The End of Early Music, Bruce Haynes draws the dividing line at the most influential political event of the 18th century, the French Revolution. The changes it brought redefined the artist's, and by extension musician's, job on a fundamental level. Aristocracy was gone, and to get by they were now dependent on the ticket-buying bourgeoisie, which quickly led to the invention of the public concert hall, a concept essentially unheard of before. Culture was now a commodity to be sold on the market, and thus also subjected to the tyranny of the masses. Musicians either had to compromise and serve the lowest common denominator, or submit to a life as starving artists, another newly invented concept. More than 200 years later, we still feel this fundamental cultural paradigm shift. To us, relevance and mass attention are essentially one and the same thing. The more members of the general public care about a musician, the more likely we are to read about them in the newspapers, see them on television, or have them recommended to us by YouTube or Facebook. We click things because they are relevant, and they are relevant because we click them. Everything else is nothing but a niche. That's the principle of pop culture. Before the big revolution, before this dividing line, things worked very differently. If you walk through an old master's gallery and look around, hardly any of the artworks you see were made to be sold on a market, to be written about in the newspapers or talked about by the largest number of people possible. Back then, painters, just as musicians, usually worked for patrons, wealthy and oftentimes highly educated people, not seldom involved in creative activity themselves. So musicians could focus on creating something a handful of inclined listeners would really appreciate, as opposed to finding a compromise that would please the largest number of people. In this environment, the shortcomings that would later disqualify the lute and its music from the public concert hall turn out to actually be strengths. Its soft sound was valued as intimate, the music's subtle complexity, requiring some concentration from the listener, as stimulating, and the absence of flashy gimmicks wasn't considered boring, but much rather stood for an understated stylishness. And it's all those things that draw me to the music and art of the time today. They show no desire to justify themselves, to convince the broad public that they are worth buying a ticket for. My fascination for the lute is owed to the understated yet uncompromising confidence of the music it was built for. And perhaps that can explain why this forgotten musical culture, which apparently just didn't fit into the industrial age, is finding new relevance today, at the dawn of the information age. The internet enables us to reach out globally, share and connect from person to person, without needing a broadcasting company or record industry as the middleman. My lute doesn't need to be loud enough to reach the other end of a concert hall, when people on the other end of the world can hear it just fine in their living rooms. In that regard, the situation of musicians today could certainly become quite similar to how it was during the Renaissance, when there was no need to sell thousands of tickets or CDs, but to find patrons. No need to please many people, but instead just the right ones. Alexis Ohanian speaks of this upcoming digital patronage as something that might soon bring a revolution to cultural production worldwide, or, as he calls it, a new renaissance.
And a number of people are saying, yeah, you know what, that's cool enough. We will be your patrons. Whoa, hold on. Art used to be something where either you made it, right? I made it, or you were a starving artist, right? There's actually a Wikipedia page for it, for crying out loud, right? It was binary. You made it or you were starving. What is changing has always existed. This is what I love about technology, is the best stuff is not innovative, it's all a remix. The only reason Michelangelo is sitting on his back for 4 years is because a bunch of Medicis were like, don't worry, we'll pay your cable bill, right?
Exactly. In this case, the Medicis are, of course, you, the viewers. This might sound like a daring proposition, but if, hypothetically, every 10th of my subscribers here on YouTube or on my website musicamemo.com chose to buy me a cup of coffee whenever I release a new episode of Memo, this could pay my cable bill and my rent. The website that Alexis Ohanian is referencing in his talk is called patreon.com, where already a number of different artists, musicians and writers have been able to make a living doing what they do best, funded entirely through these micro-donations from supporters around the globe. So I decided to take Memo to Patreon. The system is actually very simple and no less convenient than buying something on Amazon or eBay. To become a patron, you may specify a small amount you'd be happy to donate every time I create a new episode. A guideline might be the price for a cup of coffee in your home country. From this point on, these micro donations are made automatically, but only whenever I release another episode. What's important to me though is that access to Memo remains free for everyone. So these donations are not actually payment for a product, but instead support to help me continue making these videos for you and others to enjoy. You may of course cancel your patronage at any moment, and there will never be more than one video per week. That is one extra coffee per week. In the end, the total amount of support will determine how much time I can afford to invest in making new videos. And it doesn't actually take that much. 200 cups of espresso from all around the world would already enable me to work on Memo full-time. So if you're as passionate about this music as I am, please consider becoming a patron and giving your support. Even if this is a new and unfamiliar concept for you. Traditional media like television, radio, CDs that enabled previous generations of musicians to make a living are about to disappear. And unless there emerges a new form of digital patronage, all artists who don't cater to the masses are about to disappear as well. So this is something where you can really make a difference and contribute to what might very well become a new renaissance. For more videos like this one, you can always visit my website, musicamemo.com, where you'll not only find all previous episodes, but also a newsletter to which you can simply subscribe with your email address. This way I can send you a message whenever I release a new episode, which usually happens once a week, right before the weekend. So I hope to be seeing you next Friday for another installment of Memo. And if you enjoyed this video and would like to support what I do, please consider telling your friends about my show. Memo is a project I started in the hopes of introducing many new listeners to this kind of music, and the only way for me to reach them is through your support.